Good afternoon. On behalf of the Board of Trustees, welcome to the Museum of East Texas. We are honored to have everyone here this afternoon. Ellen Temple is a conservationist, a historian, educator, and publisher. In the 1980s, she published the first two books in print about the women's suffrage movement in Texas, Citizens at Last, edited by Judith N. MacArthur and Ruth Weingarten, and a Texas suffragist, is that correct?
Yeah.
Diaries and writings of Jane Y. McCallum and Janet G. Humphreys. Ellen is fascinated with the history of the long, successful struggle for women's right to vote. She is also currently chair of the History Center in Diboll, and we encourage you all to go visit the History Center. Reverend Betty Kennedy was educated in Lufkin, graduated from Prairie View A&M with a degree in education. She is a CME minister, recipient of the Angelina Award in Yellow Rose of Texas.
Wow.
Throughout her life, she has had an abundant love and compassion for all people and continues to feed their bodies and nurture our spirits. Through her portrayals of renowned women in Black history, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Rosa Parks, and others,
Listen to you.
she teaches acceptance of cultural diversity.
Wonderful.
Kay Arnold is a sixth-generation Texan. She grew up fascinated by stories of her ancestors. She received her bachelor's degree in American history, political science and economics, and her master's in Texas history and cultural anthropology, both from St. Edward's University, where she then taught Texas history to adult students. Combining her passion for history, social justice, and women's rights, Kay is working on two projects, most notably her upcoming book titled Women's Work, Texas Women United for Equal Suffrage. Please join me in welcoming them.
Hello, everybody, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to lead us off, and after I talk, just for a few minutes, about my experience with this suffrage book and about the women's suffrage movement in general, then I'm going to turn it over to Kay, who'll go into lots of good stories about the movement, and then we'll close with Betty Kennedy's inspirational words. So I'm going to lead us off, and I have notes that I need to follow, so I hope you'll bear with me, and we'll get started. It really seems fitting that we should celebrate women's right to vote in Texas on Family Day. There was a time when the only way that women in Texas could influence the making of laws that affected their families was through petition, letter writing, and persuasion. Unlike their sons and husbands and fathers, they could not vote. And they needed the vote, not only for themselves, but to benefit their families. They needed to influence government when it came to education, sanitation, clean air, clean water, you name it. They wanted some influence. So they went to work, to battle for the women's right to vote. And we learned growing up about the battle for the Alamo, right? And we learned about the battle for San Jacinto. But when I was in school, we didn't learn about the battle that women had to wage to earn the right to vote. And it took a century of struggle on the national level to pass the amendment. And it was about a 51-year struggle in Texas. When women did get the vote, the whole world seemed to change. It doubled the electorate in the United States, propelled women into public life. They started running for office. And it shaped the social history of the 20th century. leaders in the Texas effort were bold and courageous and brilliant. How many of you ever heard of Minnie Fisher Cunningham? Raise your hand. How many of you ever heard of Jane Y. McCallum? Okay. Well, these were the two of the leaders. I mean, there were many brilliant women, but these were two of the leaders who made such a mark on the movement. Minnie Fisher Cunningham not only was a leader in Texas, but she went on to lead the national movement too. And she is the only Texas woman whose name is on the plaque that's in the United States Capitol that recognizes the women's suffrage movement. Jane Y. McCallum was brilliant in the way she educated voters about the women's suffrage movement, and she went on to serve as Secretary of State under two different governors. So they were very accomplished, very brilliant women. So now you know their names. Don't forget them. Let's see, the struggle went on, as I said, for a century. And one generation passed it along to another generation. Susan B. Anthony actually died before she could legally vote. And the women picked up where she had left off and carried through to victory. When Susan B. Anthony was at a international suffrage convention in Germany, her motto was, "Failure is impossible." And that's what drove them on. Failure is impossible. So I started writing history in 1976 with the history of Diboll that ran, well, it was for the Land of the Little Angel, and then it ran in the Free Press. Paul Durham picked it up, and he ran it more than once in segments. And then the next article I wrote was the women's suffrage movement in Angelina County. And I came across an article by a historian named A. Elizabeth Taylor, and she was a pioneer historian in women's suffrage. And she had written this article for the Journal of Southern History. And I found it. It was a 1951 article, and I used that as a framework for my article about the Texas movement. And I wanted to know how they voted. You know, I wanted to know how the women got involved in the campaigns. And so I combed some of the existing archives then and just did this article. Well, after that, I got involved with Ann Richards in the Texas Women's History Project. That was in the late 1970s and early 80s. And we just discovered a wealth of information, much more than we could put into the exhibit that we created. And so I, meanwhile, formed a small press when I was living in Diboll, and I decided that I wanted to write or to publish a book about the women's suffrage movement. There wasn't anything out there, and I said, well, I can do this, you know, and I convinced Dr. Taylor, who was still a professor at Texas Women's University, to give me permission to use her article. And then she wrote this wonderful piece that's in the book called A Lifelong Interest. I hope y'all will read it, about the work that she had to do. I mean, this was way before computers. This book was before, you know, computers. And the work that she had to do, traveling back and forth between Denton and Austin, you know, picking up Mrs. McCallum's papers and taking them back to Denton and hand copying, you know, it was just quite the job. So I think you'll enjoy reading about that. Let's see. The work that I did, I got Ruth Weingarten and Judy MacArthur. Ruth had worked on the Texas Women's History Project. Judy MacArthur was a graduate student in history at UT, and I hired them to be editors of this book, and both went on to be renowned Texas historians. And we put together the book. It's a documentary history, and it contains documents and photos of the movement that had never been in print before. And I was very happy with it. You know, it's Citizens at Last, the women's suffrage movement in Texas. The second book I did was A Texas Suffragist, The Diaries and Writings of Jane Mow McCallum. And I persuaded Janet Humphrey to let me publish this book. I ran into her when she was doing research in the McCallum papers. And I said, I hope that you'll, you know, when you finish it, that you'll let me do it. And so these two books are something that I'm very proud of. Texas Women's University asked permission to use the book for an exhibit. And so they created an exhibit. They wanted it to get wider circulation, and so they gave it to Humanities Texas. And the exhibit that you'll see in the next room is one that Humanities Texas put together. They've redone it several times. It's actually their most popular exhibit that travels the state. And so thanks to JP for bringing it here to Lufkin. It's really important to know the story. So I'm going to give you a short framework for the suffrage movement in Texas as an introduction to Kay's talk. And I want to go back to the official beginning of the women's suffrage movement in the United States, which was in 1848 at Seneca Falls, when they got together and wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women. And newly acquired states like Wyoming included women's suffrage in their state constitutions beginning in 1869. But the movement did not even reach the southern states until after the Civil War. Movement toward women's suffrage in the South faced bitter opposition. The battle in Texas opened in the Reconstruction Constitutional Convention of 1868, where universal suffrage was voted down 52-13. And I checked all their votes, and our Angelina County representative voted no. The next opportunity was the 1875 convention. And y'all, we are still operating under that Constitution. It's been amended a jillion times, but that 1875, 1876 is when the people passed it, is the one we have now. But Mr. Weaver presented a suffrage resolution which was referred to committee. And though there was some discussion in the record, the convention disposed of the women's suffrage issue by ignoring it. This wasn't mentioned. In 1888, the Texas Women's Christian Temperance Union became the first union in the South to endorse women's suffrage. And that organization kept the issue of women's suffrage alive when the other organized efforts lapsed. There's a wonderful photo in the exhibit of the women in white marching down the street in Lufkin, 1915. And that was a women's Christian temperance movement event. And they were protesting downtown's 19 saloons. And they carried signs like, "Give us clean men. No more whiskey for a dry town." In 1895, A.D. Tompkins introduced the first women's suffrage resolution in the Texas House, where it died in committee. Resolutions were introduced in 1911 and 1913, and again died in committee. Women supporters rallied with their Texas Equal Suffrage Association under the leadership of the brilliant Minnie Fisher Cunningham. And by 1918 had formed 98 local societies to educate their communities and influence legislators. There was no local chapter in Angelina County, but evidently the one in Nacogdoches influenced its legislator who voted for women's suffrage. The suffragists were tireless lobbyists. Jane McCallum liked to tell this anecdote from her early days as a Texas suffragist. She had called a legislator out to the lobby in front of the House chamber to speak to him. He, "Young woman, what are you doing meddling with men's affairs? You ought to be getting married." She, "I am already married." He, "You should be having children." She, "What is the limit? I have 5. "You ought to be home taking care of them." She, "They are all in school. Besides, they have a lovely grandmother at home." and if anything should happen to them, I would be notified immediately. He, then you should be home darning stockings. In 1915, the issue came to a vote, and B.A. Calhoun of Angelina County voted yes for women's suffrage. In 1917, I.D. Fairchild of Lufkin, who had replaced Calhoun, voted no. But during this session, the legislature impeached Governor Paul Ferguson, who was an implacable foe of women's suffrage. And he did it with the support of the suffragists. And the legislature removed him from office. Lieutenant Governor William Hobby became governor, and Hobby was committed to women's suffrage. A state constitution amendment required a 2/3 vote for passage in the legislature, and then it goes to the people, for a majority vote. In 1918, the women determined that they would have a better chance of simply passing a bill in the legislature to give women the right to vote in primaries. And they were successful. Minnie Fisher Cunningham described that victory. We rose to leave the gallery of the house. The men saw us and gave us a perfect ovation, cheering for some minutes. It was a surprising and greatly appreciated tribute to the work that the women have been doing. At another time, Minnie Fish noted that we were not starry-eyed babes in the woods. We were the best politicians of our day. With the poll tax requirement waived for the women in the primary, they immediately went to work to register 386,000 women in 17 days before the election. Isn't that amazing? Hobby clubs in both Lufkin and Diboll registered voters, held public education sessions, attended rallies and speak-ins, and provided transportation and babysitting. Hobby won the primary, and so did Annie Webb Blanton, who ran for state superintendent of public instruction and was the first woman elected to a statewide office in Texas. Although women could not vote in the general election, their primary choices won at the polls. In 1919, the suffragists made another effort to pass a state constitutional amendment to give full franchise to women in Texas, and it failed after a tremendous effort. But several months later, in 1919, the Texas legislature, the first southern state to do so, ratified the 20th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And when enough states ratified, women had finally won the right to vote. I should note that the battle really did not end there. Jim Crow laws in Texas and across the South effectively denied minority women the right to vote in lots of cases, with the poll tax, with the literacy tests, and other obstacles to voting, until passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which took a tremendous effort on the parts of organizations like the NAACP, La Raza Unida. I mean, it was a tremendous effort. So even though women had the vote in the South, they were denied. So I'm going to close with one of my favorite quotes of all time. And it's Jane Y. McCallum's statement after she voted. She said, "With what high hopes and enthusiasms we entered a world in which we were citizens at last."
Very good. Very good. Well done.
And now it's my pleasure to pass the ball to Kay Arnold, who is doing exciting research on the grassroots work that women did in Texas, and particularly East Texas. So Kay, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ellen. Wow, I'll have to follow that. At least I don't have to follow this. That's all I have to say, because I've heard. So fasten your seatbelts. This is going to get bumpy because this is how I speak, like this. I grew up listening to my grandparents telling stories. They grew up in the Lockhart area, and then my dad's side in the Austin area. And I heard stories about my ancestors. We tended their graves. I read their obituaries. I mean, I felt like I knew these people that had been dead for decades. And so that kind of laid the foundation for my love of better understanding regular people. When I've taught Texas history, I've begged people, find somebody to do your paper on besides, and I know this is sacrilege, but besides Sam Houston, please find somebody else. I mean, yes, I know he's the father of Texas and Stephen F. is as well, but find somebody that means something to you or that someone that you don't know about. So that's what I wanted to do with my project, my book, Women's Work, because to me, the regular women are the story. You know, I do agree, and Minnie Fisher Cunningham is a regular woman in a lot of ways, how she started out. But I started diving into the papers at the Austin History Center, which is the Jane McCallum collection, and I found this amazing wealth of wonderful letters from women in this area. And so to narrow it down so you wouldn't have to bring a sleeping bag, I'm going to talk about 3 of them. I hope that's all right. So the first lady I'll talk about is a little bit more about Minnie Fisher Cunningham. She was born over in Walker County in March of 1882. And I need to go back and forth to my papers. I'll probably go off the rails every once in a while. But her father was a prominent planter, and he had been in the legislature before she was born. But he introduced her to Texas politics by taking her to political meetings in Huntsville. So she kind of got a taste of it. And I think she enjoyed it. She was educated as, I believe you said Ellen, didn't you? Or did you not?
I left that out. Yeah.
She was the first lady in Texas to gain her pharmacy license. And so she was educated. But what I've come to love about her was she's larger than life in a lot of things that have been published about her, but she was also like us. She was scared of what she was doing, and the letters that she wrote outline her insecurities, which I find endearing as somebody as larger than life as she is. When I was proposing my book to my editor, she wrote back that this was an ambitious proposal, which really means foolish and big. And like Mrs. Cunningham, I think I got myself into something I didn't realize how big it was going to be. So I'll kind of tell a little bit more about her. She was elected president of the Galveston Suffrage Association, and she wrote beautiful letters to Annette Finnegan, who was then the state president, and she was just giddy with the prospect of getting to talk other women into wanting the right to vote. She wrote, "I'm compelled to confess that your letter threw me into quite a flutter, and I've put in my day trying to delegate my Galveston work as you suggest, but have failed to discover any lambs to lead to the slaughter." So she's trying to find her replacement so that she can go out on the road and really get involved. So without experience, she threw herself into this grassroots effort, as we call it today. She said, "I've got really great hopes that the rudimentary house to house we are painfully accomplishing may be the beginning of some real work on the part of this organization." So in doing her work for the state, she wrote about her worries about finances as well as her abilities. And these women were avid letter writers. I mean, they couldn't text anybody, they couldn't put it on Facebook, they couldn't email anybody. And I'm so grateful because these letters are amazing. So she sent a letter to Annette Finnegan saying, "I'm taking it for granted that in sending me out, the state organization will pay my expenses. I wish I could afford to pay my own, but my time seems to be the only thing I have with which I can donate. If I'm mistaken, please let me know right away. And if I am not mistaken, please send me the names of some of the towns you want me to open up, and I will try and get some letters of introduction before I leave." And I know that most of y'all understand that a letter of introduction means that they're going to hook you up with somebody and you're not going to just land in town and go pound the streets. So that was really something that was needed. She said in another letter, I feel more and more like a very ignorant person about to undertake something too big for them. And so I thought that was beautiful. She found herself out on the road, and the correspondents began to pick up and talked about a lot of the challenges that they faced. When she was in this area, she had stayed at the Pickwick Hotel in Crockett, and she took their stationery with her, and then she hit the road, and she wrote back to Annette from Troop, Texas, which is up the road, I believe, a bit. She says, having had time to read and digest your letter of instructions since leaving Crockett, I feel more or less like Paul Revere, rather more than less. I only hope the other people are better trained in their part than the people for Crockett were. For instance, Mineola, I arrived at 8:20 at night, and I leave at 7:15 the next morning. I can't see any men. So she arrived in town and she didn't have anybody to talk to. And only 2 of the women who are prepared for my coming by you. I'm going to do my small best, but I'm awfully afraid it is not going to measure up to the grade. A word more about Crockett. I've rather changed my mind about Liguori being the high-principled gentleman giving us a fair trial. I rather think he was simply seeking to have himself backed up. The straw vote was taken by 2 antis and generally conceded to have been unfair. Also, they tried to take a straw vote of the women. I went to the Shakespeare Club and offered to pay for a telegram to Mr. Liguori commending his action. But the Shakespeare Club repudiated my offer and said they were solid for suffrage, but I couldn't induce them to sign a telegraph. A lot of the ways that the women tried to get what they wanted was they would send telegrams to their legislators from prominent citizens of the towns. And these ladies wouldn't do it. They didn't want to add their names. I didn't succeed in organizing either, in other words, in forming a suffrage club. I'm sorry to say there are a number of suffragists. I'm sorry to say, though, there are a number of suffragists there. I think they are afraid to organize while we are under fire. And there is no doubt suffrage is a live issue. Mr. Bagby, to the contrary, and he was another one of the legislators that was, under the payroll of the liquor industry, and he was a big Ferguson supporter. So there you go. He was definitely not one of the suffragists' friends. I finally succeeded in getting Mrs. Arledge and Mrs. Lipscomb to say that they would get a number of names on a telegram if it was composed, but I really doubt they're doing it. They are afraid. And so she faced fear a lot of times from the women in the communities because of ridicule. And also there was a lot in the newspapers as to what was going on up north. And Texas women, we just didn't behave like they did up there. And so they were trying to keep things separate and trying to be their own people. She says, I'll say this in closing. I guess that is all, except avoid the Pickwick Hotel as you would the pestilence. It is the worst. So, as I mentioned, Minnie Fisher Cunningham was not a wealthy woman, and she takes out on the road with no money. And she finds herself at the Garrison Traveling Men's Home in Sulphur Springs. And she writes to Annette Finnegan, please send money now. I can't pay my hotel bill. And so she's embarrassed because she couldn't. So she had to wait for the money to arrive. This is a letter that Mrs. Cunningham wrote to Miss Finnegan. And she didn't date all of her letters, which makes me a little crazy but as a historian. But it was Friday afternoon. She's sitting in the train station waiting to get from Jacksonville over to Dallas. And it's 3.5 hours late. So I thought I'd while away a few minutes telling you about Nacogdoches and Palestine. We had splendid meetings in both places, rather larger in Nac, and she even said it like that, Nac. I didn't know they called it, I knew we did, but I didn't know that she did. But very much in earnest in Palestine. The memberships of both organizations, curiously enough, is the same, 12. Miss Kate Hunter of 209 South Sycamore Street is the Palestine president, and she promises to be a wonder. Please send her lots of literature as she intends to make a house to house and an office to office to invite people to hear Miss Todd. Miss Todd was one of the national speakers that the that they sent down from Washington, and she was supposed to be quite it. And let me tell you, you must send them Miss Todd, or I'll never dare show my head in East Texas again. They'll kill me. They'd really like to have her tomorrow. Now, this was going in the mail. How could she get her there tomorrow? But anyway, I never saw anything like the way they hunger and thirst for her coming and read every scrap in the papers about her. Of course, these places do not expect to pay Miss Todd, but they do expect to pay their hall and a good bit of the local advertising. That's right, isn't it? That was my understanding of your instructions. It wasn't right. They were supposed to pay her. So Miss Hunter says if they can have Miss Todd, they will make their chapter the best chapter of all in the state organization. I believe she can come very near doing it with the necessary limitations of size. Her spirit is wonderful. Next time you send me out, you'll have to send along with me somebody to talk to. I'm simply perishing with ingrowing conversation. Have you ever heard a term like that? Meeting all these splendid women and never having a chance to talk it over as I go. And I mean, these letters, they are scrawled. They are horrible penmanship in a lot of them. But they are just dying for somebody to talk to and tell about their ups and their downs of being on the road. There's several letters about planning the annual convention that was going to be down at Galveston. That was going to be quite a thing. And Mrs. Cunningham was to chair that event and organize that event. Annette Finnegan got sick, and shortly after that, Minnie Fisher Cunningham found herself to be the president of the Texas Equal Suffrage Association. And she held 4 consecutive one-year terms. So she saw it through to when women did gain suffrage. I'm sorry?
How many members?
I don't know the exact number of that.
Shouldn't be too many.
I'm sorry? I couldn't hear you.
I don't expect that there were too many members there.
Oh, there were hundreds of women. Oh, there were. I think so far what I've been saying is that when these ladies went town to town, and I've got another example of the lady that was up in Palestine, when they went, they were amongst their own friends and their own neighbors, and a lot of times people were scared to say I was for this because they didn't really understand what it was about, a lot of times. Yeah. No, it's okay. We're all friends. It's all good. I kind of like to think that when she became president, she took with her what she learned on the road. It was kind of like working for a boss that actually knows what your job is. I think that she took that with her. Everybody's laughing about that. Don't look around, you'll see who's laughing, and then you'll know where they work, and you'll see what I'm talking about. But I think she took with her that ability to understand not knowing what was going on out there and how it would feel and how to shore these other women up. As president, she had to juggle not only Texas was a southern state, as Ellen said, and they had their ways of wanting to do things. The National Association wanted us to work also on trying to get the constitutional amendment passed too. And so Minnie Fisher Cunningham is trying to juggle both of these things at the same time. She's got her few volunteers that are willing to go out for the cause here in Texas, but she's still dealing with Washington, D.C. So she's got both of these things going on. Well, then the Southern Association splits off from the Northern Association because they wanted to do things differently with Jim Crow laws and poll taxes. They wanted to be exclusionary, and Texas tried to be both. Texas tried to join both the Northern or the National Association and also be in the Southern Association. And at first, Minnie Fisher Cunningham didn't understand the clear distinction between the two by saying how anybody in suffrage work finds time and stamps and paper to bicker of the division of work when there is more than all of us can do and new opportunities opening up. Every day is more than I can comprehend, but I wish we were well out of it. So that was her answer to that. She wanted to just rid herself of that. Now, when people came to Texas from the National Association, like speakers that would go town to town. She was well aware of, since she had been on the road, she knew what it was like to go into these towns, and she knew what the national workers were like, and she didn't want the two to butt heads. So she always encouraged the local organizer to meet up with the National Association ladies that would come to speak so that they wouldn't step on toes. So she said, when she was talking about one of them, she says, she's new to our field and she'll need a Texas woman to add the necessary local color and smooth over possible mistakes made through ignorance of local conditions. So I thought that was an interesting little touch. So here's a little clip from a newspaper in Houston about one of those national women, and you might see on the other side of it why many would want somebody to go with her. Miss Elizabeth Freeman, a veteran of 14 suffrage campaigns, is in Houston. She's here to organize the women of the state for the Red Hot Eat 'em Up campaign that is due in the soon coming future. She's been in Texas 3 weeks, has visited 20 towns, and plans to be just as busy in the state for the next 4 months. Miss Freeman isn't entirely complimentary of men. She hasn't got one of her own, and she, being womanly, infers that she could have roped one of the creatures if she'd wanted him. She was frank in her statement that there is big work of cleaning up to be done in Texas. She believes firmly that when the women of Texas, women of the state have the vote, they will go promptly about it. Texas needs someone to look after its business right. The men have failed, she remarked. That's why she didn't want her to go out by herself, right? Because you don't make a bunch of men that are supposed to be voting to help you change the law mad. That's the way I look at it. So, okay, so I'm going to switch off of Minnie Fisher Cunningham. I'm going to talk about another lady. She was from Sabine County over at Hemphill, and I sure hope I don't step on any toes with that. So, y'all got any tomatoes or anything? All right, here it goes. Okay, so the next one I'm going to talk about is Mrs. Hiram Knox. You all may have heard some, guess not, I'm getting blank faces. Good. Okay, so her name was Lillian Marshall when she came to East Texas, and she was a nurse, and she was hired to work for the Hiram Knox family. She began caring for Mrs. Knox until her death, and then she cared for the senior Mr. Knox until his death. While caring for the senior Mr. Knox, she fell in love with the junior, and they married. And Mr. Knox had been known for his lumber company, and he was determined to move from up in North Texas down to Sabine County. Well, Junior wasn't good at business, and so speaking of cleaning things up, the new Mrs. Knox, by then a mother, took control of many of the business affairs. She needed a railroad to their lumber company, and she put on her coveralls, went outside, and saw to it because she wanted it done. She was quite a generous philanthropist, and she was very generous to her employees and others in the county. During 1918 and 1919, letters with Mrs. Cunningham indicated that Mrs. Knox acted as the chairman of the 14th Senatorial District, which covered Nacogdoches, San Augustine, Sabine, Tyler, Jasper, Newton, Hardin, Liberty, Jefferson, and Orange counties. And so you know how I keep this straight when I'm doing my research. I have taken this great big map and I've colored and outlined things, and I take a picture and I have it in my phone so that whenever I hit something I think, okay, which senatorial district was this? Because Mrs. Cunningham decided if we're going to lobby these senators, I need to break them down into their senatorial groups. And she got her women to work like one would be over the whole senatorial district, and then each one had a county representative as well. So back to Mrs. Knox. She did not hit the road in a prolonged way like Minnie Fisher Cunningham had done. She wrote checks and made speeches locally. She didn't have to pinch pennies, which is different than how Mrs. Cunningham was. She was able to pledge and make good on the pledge $25 a month, which was an equivalent of about $350 by today's terms. So that was, to the organization, that was a small fortune because the dues were 25 cents, and a lot of women had a hard time coming up with that during the war, especially during World War I. So she did organize and lead her district well. Her letters were beautiful, but it was a tough district. She faced just a lot of apathy in their area, but also the legislators were not favorable to the women's suffrage. She wrote, yes, conditions were very bad in San Augustine County, and the results show that. In spite of the campaign which we held, results were very bad in Sabine County, and it is a matter of great mortification that the citizenship of this county looks so poorly on our own interest and the welfare of the state of Texas that Mr. Ferguson carried this county. The here tell us that had we not worked vigorously for Mr. Hobby, Ferguson's majority would have been even greater. Jim Ferguson had been impeached, and he was back on the ballot in spite of the fact that he had been told he would never be able to hold office in the state of Texas, and these counties voted for him anyway. So a week later, Mrs. Cunningham wrote to Mrs. Knox, Mr. Terrell of Cherokee County, while having registered as a suffragist until it came to the pinch, not only would not sign our petition to the governor to submit the measure, but went around and persuaded others to take their names off. If we had depended on him, we would not have the ballot yet. Unless you have a special reason for not doing so, I hope that you will ask your representative to support Mr. Thompson, who was running against Mr. Terrell for Speaker of the House. How am I doing on time? They're not falling out of their seats bored yet, but we doing okay?
Another, what do you need?
About 10?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah,
Okay.
we're doing great.
Okay. Sorry, I just don't want to go
doing
over.
great.
Okay, so got that already.
Was she guilty or innocent?
Oh, well, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. I know, right? Okay, so as I said, the women weren't Ferguson fans, and Mrs. Knox helped start hobby clubs in her town to help get Lieutenant Governor Hobby elected governor. What happened? There it is, okay. On April 6, 1917, the United States entered World War I. It made a big change for the suffrage movement. Women then became, they would fill in some spots that men had vacated, but they became educated on how to conserve food and preserve food. There were schools that went around. Home Economics Week was celebrated. A lot of that was going on to educate homemakers on how to be more thrifty with what they had. But they were conservative in other ways too, to be able to buy war bonds and things like that. They did with what they had and made do. In March of 1919, Mrs. Cunningham wrote to Mrs. Knox, I did not attend the National Convention in St. Louis as I had previously planned. During World War I, the sacrifices that they were making did mount up. I did not attend the National Convention in St. Louis as I had planned and had spoken to you of, because we have been overwhelmed by the news of the loss of my only brother in France. And I must make to you my apologies for having failed to send you credentials in order that you might attend if you would. You will readily understand, I am sure, that I am working without being able to concentrate my full attention on the work, and forgive me. And I just think how at this time, this was just a few very small months before this measure went before the Texas legislature to ratify the constitutional amendment. And here she is, her only brother has been killed in the war, and she's still trying to press on. You wanted to know something about Mrs. Knox. Well, as the legislature did ratify the federal amendment, Mrs. Knox wrote to Mrs. Cunningham, after the victory. She says, you probably need a rest. Why don't you come up here to Hemp Hill? There's nothing to see up here but a good place to rest and where no one could bother you, and I certainly would enjoy having you. By the way, I've been down and sick in bed with malarial fever, but I'm all right now. If you'd invited me to your house and you'd had malarial fever, I probably would have said, no, that's all right, it's all good. So, okay, so here's what inquiring minds wanted to know. Misfortune and intrigue befell the Knox family thereafter. Mr. Knox had speculated during the wartime and borrowed a lot of money to buy more timberland for their lumber company, and when the war ended quickly, his note became due and he wasn't able to make good on that. And so luckily enough, there was another lumber company that was willing to buy his lands, the Temple Lumber Company. So in 1922, Mr. Knox was killed in his bed by a gunshot to the back of his head. Though arrested, Mrs. Knox was not indicted by the grand jury, and she left Sabine County shortly after that. In 1937, she and her oldest son were questioned in the death of Mary Knox, another relative in Dallas, shortly after she leaves Texas. Thereafter, there were allegations of con jobs and hot checks and a prison sentence, and instability is my way of saying things weren't going good. She died in Illinois and is buried in a pauper's grave, which there's a book about her and about the tragedies and everything, but they didn't realize that she had been such a leader in the East Texas movement for women's suffrage, and I think she was very helpful in that. I think it's a tragedy what their family befell, and it is listed still today as an unsolved murder. So the last suffragist I'm going to tell you about is Kate Hunter at Palestine, because Minnie Fisher Cunningham said absolutely right. She was a wonder. She was born over at Brushy Creek in 1866, and Miss Hunter was from a family that was comfortable enough to send her to private school, and she attended Sam Houston to become a teacher. And then she traveled a bit to study music, and that was her love. She was a school teacher in the area from time to time, but she also taught piano and music from her home. She never married. She lived at home with her mother and cared for her mother. She was involved in cultural clubs, which led to the Federated Women's Club, which led her to Galveston, where she heard all these neat ladies talking, and that set the hook for her for suffrage. Minnie Fisher Cunningham had visited this area once, and so they'd been acquaintances, but that was all it took, was her hearing the wonderful speeches in Galveston. My finding her files has just been such a wealth of wonderful information, not only about the suffrage movement, but about what was going on here. At the time, money was so tight in Palestine that she compared the financial situation to that of just after the Civil War, that it was dire. And so she didn't have the money. Even though her family had been comfortable enough in her childhood, at this time she wasn't able to pay for her travel expenses, much like Minnie Fisher Cunningham had said when she went out to hit the road. The first letter I found from Miss Hunter was, her excitement about being a part of the organization. The next thing you know, she's the head of the senatorial district and the vice president of this organization. So she jumped in with both feet. She understood that she was to induce and entice women in Anderson County, Cherokee, Houston, Trinity, and Angelina. And she wanted organizations in every one of those counties. And she was able to travel in the summertime when she was not teaching. And she just lamented and lamented. I need names in this town. Send me names. Does anybody know anybody? She didn't have a car. She didn't have any money, but she was going to make sure that this area got covered. I am not so sure of other places, she wrote. So many of them have failed to respond that I abandoned the idea. This is Minnie Cunningham responding to her, asking for names. I am not sure of the other places. So many of them have failed to respond that I abandoned the idea of a general letter to the press, fearing the display of the fact that I didn't have any names would make it look bad. And she says, I feel sure that in some way this is my failure, and I shall not rest satisfied until I have analyzed the reason and in some measure remedied it. Is it not strange that no matter how great this cause, so much still hangs on our personality? So she thought she'd done something wrong and that she had repelled people from the suffrage movement, which is not it. So Miss Hunter, thinking, I'll go along with you on that trip. I won't have to make a speech, but I'll just go along with you. And there's a zillion letters almost every day these two women write. And it turns out instead of going along with Minnie Fisher Cunningham, she was going to have to go out without her. And she said, well, okay, I can do that, but send me a speaker. Well, it turns out she's not going to have a speaker either. So this 49-year-old school teacher who has never made a speech in her life hits the road. And they talked back and forth about train schedules and trolleys and hotels and certain people that they might know in these, and she's on her way to Dallas, but she's going to hit all these little towns along the way. And I've got my map out at the thing, and I'm looking and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, how exciting. So here she goes. They also talked a lot about pinching pennies because they just did not have money. I will do the best I can, and where I fail, you on the spot will have to work out the problem on your own, said Minnie Fisher Cunningham. And I have not the least fear, but that you will do it well. I have every confidence in you, and you must have it in yourself. That is half the battle. And do not be discouraged if in the right new places you do not get a hearing. But always let me know, because I am counting the money, and I would hate for it to run out with you 1,000 miles from home. Speaking of money, please don't worry about your pledge. You're doing more than money could buy. A few days later, Miss Cunningham wrote to Miss Hunter. Now, Miss Hunter, dear Miss Hunter, I know we have very little money, but do not make yourself sick doing the things to economize when a small expenditure would save your strength. Remember that Texas is going to need you and the valuable experience you are getting on top of that you already had after the vote is won. Quite as much now. When the money is gone, we will devise ways and means of getting more. I already told you that. Oh, I know. When she went out and they asked for a speaker to come, Miss Hunter wrote to Miss Cunningham, I was amused at the host calling for such a fine speaker. If he knew what a new recruit was getting, he wouldn't feel so elated. I shan't fail. I know what I have to do. And say. My facts and my arguments are well in my mind. If only my voice will carry for such a crowd. Even after having been at all these speaking gigs for well over a year, Minnie Fisher Cunningham expressed her concerns as well. She told her, Miss Hunter, I have been invited to deliver a suffrage talk at the municipal celebration of Independence Day in Houston. It is quite a triumph for us to have a speaker on the program. I am rather sorry he chose me to represent them. Frankly, I am scared. And Miss Hunter bolstered her back up too. Be not afraid. There is spirit within you that will give you the power to speak and even put words in your mouth if you will only trust and look to that spirit. Another worry associated with funds was clothes. When asked to attend an event in Brownwood, knowing that all the ladies were of ample means, Minnie Fisher Cunningham wrote to Miss Hunter, I have been invited officially to attend and bring greetings. You do not know how I dread it, if for nothing but the question of clothes. That is one nice thing about suffrage work, I guess. If you have one decent rag to speak in and another to travel in, that is ample. But then she needed to go to the national convention, and she's freaked out about her clothes again. It's not just like us. I mean, seriously. She wrote to Miss Hunter, Mr. Cunningham said I might have $100 for clothes, but if I wanted to make out with a suit and some blouses, I could give $50 to the association. See, she's pitching pennies when he's throwing money at her. He thought it was very silly and unbusinesslike of me to think of not going to this convention for the sake of our own work. Well, of course, this tickles me. Well, of course, a real suffragist can do without clothes if she has enough wherewithal to escape the vigilance of the authorities. Might have gotten the vote a lot faster, huh? Who knows? So now 50 of my 100 goes in there with a donation, and Atlantic City business thrown in for good measure. Aren't we in luck? In August of 1915, Miss Hunter went over to Mahia. She was delayed in her travels, so she arrived on Monday. Monday morning is hard for housekeepers, she said, but I made a talk, and suffragists started here in the shape of people thinking about it. I went down in the audience myself and tried to get them to organize. The way that they organize these people is like, if you're looking at me and you look like you're interested, you're the president. That's how they did it. And so I'm pretty sure that a lot of people tried to get up and run off, but that's how they did. They didn't ask, can you be the president? They just made people the president. And then they'd get a letter a little bit later from a lady saying, I really can't serve. And sometimes it was because they thought it over themselves, but oftentimes they would go home and discuss it with their husbands, and their husbands would not want them to. And a lot of times that was because it was a reflection on the husband or his business, and it would cause them problems. And so there is a plethora, so many letters. I got your name and we want to appoint you county president. And then there's a letter back, oh, I'm so honored that you asked me, but I can't. I've got all this other work. And so that went on a lot with all of these counties. But so Ms. Hunter goes down in the crowd to organize. But they held back. They're not ready, not quite ready for it yet. Both the leaders who believe in equal suffrage are out of town. Now, I am known here, and I think my coming has created a good impression for suffrage. I leave in half an hour for Waxahachie, where I speak in the morning at the public library, and a beautiful library it is. On another trip, that hot August of 1915, Miss Hunter writes, the same mail that brought your letter brought me an invitation from a committee of businessmen at Marquez to come and speak there the next day. It being an election day, I got the letter just before noon, too late to plan any stopover at Jewett, but I thought I might stop on the way back. There was a perfectly fine crowd of men. I spoke in an open, vacant lot, more than 100, and just a few ladies. Not a dozen, but my personal friends. The lady who made the arrangements for me and secured the invitation is the first citizen of Marquez. Do they have that? Is it like an election? I'm just teasing. I don't know. She deemed her the first citizen of Marquez. And then I taught, and I had taught there the first year I taught music. So I went under very favorable circumstances. And I believe I set the ball to rolling for suffrage. One young man from, I assume it's Yale University because it says YU, went out on the streets after the speaking and said he had no idea there was so much sentiment for suffrage down in the backwoods. But let me tell you the finale. Just as I finished, I almost reeled and fell into a faint. They had to get ice water and carry me 1 block in an auto. I went down not well, and I just can't stand the heat. I'm afraid this will be my last venture out this summer unless I can get Mrs. Morris to go out in the county. I must cut out Taylor and Mejia. I haven't heard from either place lately. Since both Miss Hunter and Mrs. Cunningham were of an age to remember the great storm in Galveston of 1900, I found this letter, a little piece from it, really touching. Miss Hunter wrote in response to the Category 4 hurricane that hit August 17, 1915. It hit Galveston. It will be impossible for me to impress to you in words the anxiety I have felt for you and the people of Galveston, and to say that I am thankful you are safe does but half express it. The storm moved inland and it was felt by Miss Hunter. She said, I went out that afternoon to Waxahachie and the storm was on that night and raged the next day. I could think of nothing that day but of you and Mrs. Rennie and the stricken people of Galveston. Of course, I did not have a meeting. I was with friends and we stayed in the next day with the storm still raging. That afternoon I came to Dallas in the storm, still not knowing the fate of the people in Galveston. The next morning the papers gave us the information that there were only a few lives lost, and there was rejoicing everywhere. Just a few more descriptions. Miss Hunter wrote, Mrs. Morris arranged a meeting a few days before she was down there. Oh, she went to El Campo, I think. No? Anyway, we went in her car. We had 2 full cars, 9 ladies, and I hope we made an impression with the strength of the movement here. We took us about 50 unsold women's journals. They were magazines and distributed them to the men from the country on Saturday in front of the stores and on the streets. And they took them eagerly. We had a meeting at the new high school building and about 15 more ladies came. We invited the men, but they didn't come. I spoke to them for about an hour and we organized. What do you think of that? The first time they were timid about it, but 8 declared they would join. We were all so pleased at getting the papers to the farmers and then getting an organization too. Do write them an encouraging letter, but don't ask them to do anything right now. Minnie Fisher Cunningham's letters were like, do this, do this, do this, and then go do this, and then do this, and do this. And I think that Miss Hunter was trying to protect this little new organization she started. And I'll try to go down there assume. It didn't cost anything. We went after dinner and came home before supper. Next Saturday, I'm going to Natchez. One of the ladies has promised to get up a meeting for me. I can leave here at 1 o'clock and get there in 30 minutes. I think several of the ladies will go with me. It's really interesting because it's like she's talking on the phone. I think several of the ladies will go with me. The trains have changed time to my great joy, and they get out at 10 a.m. and at 9:35. This will enable me to give 3 lessons, so she's still teaching music, and then she can go out when she can. Because of her experiences out in the field, Miss Hunter started some law courses up at Palestine so that women could better understand what these laws were, or what the laws were that affected them and why it would be necessary to get the vote. They didn't realize what laws and rights they were missing. These classes were taught by Judge Tarleton from Austin. He was a law professor at the University of Texas. The courses were like how to make out a will, and he brought models of how those were and how to make out deeds. She went on to educate women on how to vote, just like Jane McCallum had, once they had the right to do so. So quite a number of years later, it's not dated, but I can tell by the recollections that Ms. Hunter has. She was interviewed about her suffrage experience, and she said, "There was an old lady in the town where I lived whom I loved dearly. She almost wept to think of my being a refined lady going into that suffrage work. Said I would come back a changed woman, and I said, I hope I will be a changed woman. Some of the people who had known me all my life would turn their heads when they saw me coming and wouldn't speak to me. And nobody had better standing. I was a lady of the first standing in my community. The men and some of the women, however, wouldn't speak to me at all. Some of the best ladies in town thought that I had disgraced myself. Instead of that, I feel the suffrage work is the crowning part of my life." She also described in this interview Dr. Anna Howard Shaw coming to Texas, and she traveled around with her. She was from Washington, D.C., and she was one of the biggest organizers, I think, of women's suffrage, and one of the biggest proponents. And when she came to Palestine, she spoke to 2 separate groups, and one was a white group and one was an African American group. And Miss Hunter went along with her to both, and she got quite a bit of flack for going along to the African American group. And she said, and I quote, "I don't care." And so I kind of applauded that. But she said that she was really pleased to see Dr. Shaw speaking in her town. Oh, I'm coming to the end. Y'all can wake up now. In September 1915, Miss Hunter writes, "I did not think to ask you to keep those horrid scrawls of letters I wrote you from each place. They will make a foundation for the history of the movement in Texas. I mean, of course, a part of the foundation." Then in clearer moments, she wrote, she remembered what all she'd written in those letters, and she thought, wait a minute. She writes, and she says, "Never mind, throw them away." So this is Minnie Fisher Cunningham's response. "I know just how you feel about your letters going on file. I collapsed when I realized Miss Finnegan had filed all of mine. I asked her everything under the sun and told her everything I knew, though that wasn't much. But if you only knew what a comfort a well-regulated file is, you'd never even keep house without one again. And I don't suppose anyone will ever read the letters but me." When I saw that, I kind of chuckled. I was like, I did. And y'all are. So I'm very grateful that they did save every letter. It's been like getting to know these ladies, and the people at the Osmond History Center have been very generous with the time and allowing me. They're wonderful, they are. And when I hit one of those holy cow moments and I kind of chuckle out loud, they all want to know what I'm laughing about. So each one of those letters, though, has been a treasure. I will say that they've affected me in a couple of unexpected ways. After I spend a day reading that stuff, I can't even do a text message in normal today stuff, like LOL doesn't, it's like respectfully yours, and so anyway, yeah, they get really formal. I think also the most important part is to be able to see the personal side of some very, very public people, and to be able to see the struggles that they faced as real women, as working women, as mothers, as teachers. I thought that was crucially important to know, and I hope to be able to share their stories in my book in a full way without knocking everybody out, asleep. But I have many, 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 many more names of women in this area, and I'm going to have my business card here if you want to take it as my email address. If you want me to look up your ancestors, I'm happy to do so, because I've got it in kind of a semi-searchable database, and I'd be happy to share your stories. But I also invite you, if you know of anybody in your family and you've got any records, I'd love to hear the stories, and I encourage you to email me or give me a call. So I think I'm going to pass that on to you now. I really am sorry.
I'm honored to share this table with these ladies because my perspective is a little different from what they have shared. So watch as I carry you through my journey. In 1863, we were freed. January the 1st, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment gave the minority women, black, freedom, and men, and those who were slaves. I am a granddaughter of a slave, so my journey is a little different because in 1865, we heard about that we were free in Galveston, Texas, when Colonel Granger came and made the announcement that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed, and we were free. And there was shouting in the streets of Galveston. 1896, the Jim Crow laws, separate but equal, was over our heads for many years, that we had to bear the embarrassment of not being recognized as true citizens. We had to go to colored white fountains, colored white restrooms. We had separate schools, and that made a difference because we found out that the schools were not equal. The NAACP was organized in 1909, and that was to help to strengthen our recognition as citizens of this great country of America and of Texas. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy passed laws to strengthen the recognition of people of color. So after his assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was from Texas, passed many of the civil rights movements. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act gave us the recognition as a people, and that was certainly gave a recognition to black women of this era. In 1965, the Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, that we all could vote and be recognized. 1968, Martin Luther King, who had struggled with fighting for rights for blacks of our era, was assassinated April the 4th, 1968. So in 1970, discrimination was outlawed. So therefore, we were able to go to schools with people of other races, and we were recognized then as citizens of this great state and of this great country. Barbara Jordan, and that name rings out, who attended Texas Southern, but I had the privilege of knowing her sister, Rosemary, at Prairie View. She was my classmate. So my status with Rosemary and Barbara, because Barbara's mother would bring her to Prairie View during our tenure there, and we had a chance to know Barbara as a young girl growing up in Houston and visiting with us at Prairie View. Rosemary was a beautiful soloist and could sing beautifully, and she's still living. The other two girls of her family have passed away. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was a Southerner, fought for civil rights and gave us many rights of recognition. So my standard, my recognition as a granddaughter of a slave is a little different from many persons, because we didn't always have that right to vote or the right to even be a citizen. 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment gave us that right. I was born in 1797. I was born on a plantation. My mother loved me, and she held me and rocked me and told me that I was beautiful as she stroked my little brown cheeks. Then I was sold. I was 11 years old, and I was sold to the Neelys, and the beatings began. I was sold to the Shrivers, and then to the Dumots. The beatings continued. I decided I was going to run away, and I did. I ran away from old man Dumot's plantation, and I went north. I went to New York City. There I heard that these wonderful people here were against slavery. So I joined them, and I stood among them and fought against slavery. I heard that these folk on this side were for women's rights and the struggle for women. So I joined them, and I stood. I came into an audience full, packed. I went down front, and my friend pulled my skirt tail and kept me from going front. But I pulled anyway, and I went down front, and I sat on the front seat. That man up there said a woman has to be helped into carriages and have the best place anywhere. Nobody never helped me into carriages over mud puddles or gave me the place anywhere. Yes, now ain't I a woman? Look at my arms. I have plowed and I've planted, I've gathered bonds. Now ain't I a woman? I could eat as much as any man. I could bear the lash as well. Now ain't I a woman? That little man over there in the black suit said that a woman had no rights because Christ wasn't a woman. But where did your Christ come from? God and woman. And man had nothing to do with it. Now ain't I a woman? Yes, I am a woman. If the first woman that God ever made could turn this world upside down, then women together can turn it right side up again. Now ain't I a woman?
Thank you.
Sojourner Truth.
Yes.
And she fought for rights of women to vote, to stand up, and to be recognized throughout this country. And the cry today has also been heard. What she stood for, that we as women together can change this world and make this world a better place in which to live. Now, ain't I a woman?
Thank you. Oh, thank you, Betty, and thank you. How beautiful. And